My title is On Account of Mr. Wesley, No Kedai Mamak for Me, ? A few years ago, Muslim restaurants remained open during Ramadan. A couple of days before one Raya, I had lunch at a kedai mamak in KL. My server was a foreign worker from India. I asked him how long he'd been in KL and what he planned to do over the Raya holidays. He said he'd been in KL for 4 years and that he would remain in the restaurant over Raya. I asked him what he liked about KL. He kept quiet. I asked him what he thought of Dataran Merdeka. He said he'd never been there. I asked where he'd been. He said nowhere. He'd been in KL for 4 years. He'd gone no further than Jalan Imbi. I didn't press him further. I later learned that foreign workers in our restaurants work the whole day, are required to be on their feet all day, are allowed little food, and don't get sick leave or a day off every week. I wondered how John Wesley would have reacted. Would he have resolved, no more kedai mamak for me, and told all Methodists to do the same? Why did I think of Wesley and that resolution? Because I remembered an article I'd read days earlier on a BBC website. The title was No Sugar for Me. The author was Reverend Julian Drew, pastor of a Methodist church in Wales. He said in Wales, people don't put sugar in their tea on account of Mr. Wesley. The story of John Wesley, slavery, and sugar is little known today, even among Methodists. How do I know? Because I've spoken of it during sermons I've given in Methodist churches, and my hearers told me so. John Wesley wrote entries in his journal about slavery. He wrote pamphlets about slavery. He urged all people, especially Methodists, to stop using sugar because it was produced using slave labor. The last letter he wrote before he died was to William Wilberforce, the British Member of Parliament who moved the bill in Parliament to abolish the slave trade. The bill became law in 1807, 16 years after Wesley died. The last letter Wesley wrote before he died was on the 24th of February, 1791. It was a letter to Wilberforce. In the letter, in a godly tone, Wesley encouraged Wilberforce to continue his fight against slavery. It was a short letter. I'll read you a portion of it. Reading this morning a tract wrote by a poor African, I was particularly struck by that circumstance that a man who has a black skin, being wronged or outraged by a white man, can have no redress, it being a law in our colonies, that the oath of a black against a white goes for nothing. What villainy is this? Last week I learned from a paper by Rickon Carey that the tract Wesley referred to was a biography released 2 years earlier by a former slave in America, a Methodist. The title was The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African. Wesley read, wrote, and preached much. He engaged actively in many public reforms, including the ending of slavery. In June 1772, a British judge, Lord Mansfield, had a case about a slave who refused to return from Britain to his master in America. Much of the evil of slavery was exposed in court thanks to another Christian, Granville Sharp. Lord Mansfield ruled in favor of the slave. It was front-page news. 6 weeks later, Wesley read a tract by Anthony Benezet, a Quaker who lived in America, in Philadelphia. Benezet powerfully exposed the evils of slavery. Wesley was deeply moved. About a year later, Wesley published his own tract against slavery. He titled it Some Thoughts Upon Slavery by John Wesley, A.M. Thousands of copies were circulated. Wesley openly, actively, vigorously supported the anti-slavery movement. He even preached against slavery in Bristol, a center of slaveholding. There a commotion broke out when he roundly condemned slavery. When I feel down in my efforts to push for reforms, I remember Wesley, sugar, and the end of slavery, and I try to avoid shops which exploit foreign workers on account of Mr. Wesley and his master, Son of God. In my work to understand and to promote understanding of why, in God's plan, Amri Chekmat, Joshua and Ruth Hilmy and Raymond Cole became victims of enforced disappearance, I often feel alone and hopeless. In my distress, I look for examples of faith in the communion of saints. The names you will recognize amongst my companions are Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King Jr., and John Wesley. I'll tell you something about Wesley, something which comforts me. I'm now following an inquest in Shah Alam. It's an investigation before a Sessions Court judge acting as coroner into the death of a 25-year-old man called Rupen, who was serving a sentence in Kajang prison. The case is ongoing. The judge hasn't decided the case. In my opinion, the evidence, heard in open court, shows Rupen died due to negligence on the part of Kajang prison and on part of Kajang hospital. On each hearing day, the judge begins by considering other cases, often of men charged with using illegal drugs. I see them, heads shaven, chained to each other in prison guard, held for months before trial. Prison reform is of interest to me. It was of interest to John Wesley too, and I draw comfort from his interest. Wesley was a great admirer of the Christian prison reformer John Howard. He once said, Howard was one of the greatest men in Europe. Wesley visited prisons often. There was one period of 9 months when he preached at least 67 times in prisons. He once described them as nurseries of all manner of wickedness, for prisons can promote rather than impede criminal thoughts and actions. Wesley was forbidden from making return visits to some prisons because of the caustic remarks he made in public about them. Once he wrote in his journal that he was forbidden to go to Newgate prison for fear of making the prisoners wicked, and to Bedlam, a mental institution, for fear of driving the detainees mad. Wesley wasn't just a critic, he also gave praise. Once, on a return visit to Newgate prison in Bristol, he noticed a remarkable improvement. He wrote a letter to a newspaper about the changes he noticed there. In 2012, a Methodist website in the USA carried an article about Wesleyan prisons. The author, John Singleton, included some remarks about Wesley's letter. This is what he wrote. So remarkable was the transformation from the filth, the stench, the misery, and wickedness of previous days, that Wesley declared the prison to be wearing a new face. He called for the blessing of God and man upon its remarkable keeper and his amazing achievement. Although Wesley does not mention the fact, the Bristol Newgate prison was run by a Mr. Abel Dagger, an early convert of the evangelical revival. But how different was this keeper's prison from those up and down the country? Meanwhile, will no one follow his example? Asked Wesley in his final sentence. In the opening sentence, he had protested that of all the seats of woe on this side of hell, few equaled Newgate prison. Wesley was a remarkable servant of God. He engaged so much with the world. He longed for, worked for, strained for great reforms. He didn't hesitate to use the pulpit. He was bold in his words. He pleased God. He continues to inspire. He was not alone. I've named a few. William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, Olaudah Equiano, Anthony Benezet, Abel Dagg. I should add John's brother, Charles, who was much interested in prison reform. There were many others. Do our congregations know of them? Are they inspired by them? Who are their counterparts in Malaysia today? What causes are they pushing? Where? Who's helping them generate the kind of awareness that's needed to make great changes? What should we stop doing on account of Mr. Wesley? Thank you for your attention.